All righty. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Colleen Del Vecchio, and I'm very excited today to be talking to you about successful team culture, and particularly right now, team culture of when we are apart and trying to keep our team cultures going or building them when you are working from home. So, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start off with something fun. And while we give everybody another minute or so to log in, I know some people are just joining in and getting their technology set up. So while they do that, here is the Emoji Movie Challenge. So if you know the answers to any of these emoji movies, please type those in the Zoom group chat. See if you can figure any of them out while we give folks a minute or so to get their technology all set up.
Yep.
Great. You can feel free to say them or type them in the chat too, if you wanted to unmute yourself. I will mute everybody once we get started. Yes, Rebecca, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That is the last one. Correct. Any other guesses on any of our emoji movie challenges? Oh, Throw Mama from the Train. Yes, that is right. That is the first one.
I'm not good at these.
Is that Black Tiger?
Black Panther. Very close. Whoever said that. Yep. Black Panther. All right, we'll give it another 10 seconds or so to get the last couple of people who are joining us in. For those of you who did just join in and you're wondering if you're on the right call, we are going to talk about team culture today. But while we give everyone a minute to get their technology up, I have thrown up some emoji movie challenges here to see if folks can figure out which all the movies are. So far, we've gotten Black Panther, Throw Mama from the Train, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. All right. I'm going to get people muted and get started, and we'll come back to this at the end. So I'll give all the answers then. All right. So as we kind of start to talk about this whole idea of work culture, right, and what work culture is right now and has been in the past, and how do you make for good work culture, I think it's important to really talk a little bit, just briefly, about this idea of the changing workforce, right? So the past, and when I mean the past, I'm talking even like 10 years ago, right? The past, most times in the workforce, right, this is what it looked like. It looked like people looking for a paycheck, some satisfaction, having a good boss, having a general annual review that typically focused on their weaknesses and what they needed to fix, and really the idea that this was a job for folks. Now, right, what this has transitioned to, and I think will continue, is this idea of a job being part of our purpose, of our development. People are looking for jobs to find out how can they grow. Instead of a boss, they're looking for a coach. They're looking for someone who can kind of help them grow and learn. They're not looking for annual reviews, right? They're looking for ongoing conversations to kind of help their development. Folks are wanting to focus more on strengths and not weaknesses. And myself, I'm a huge fan of Gallup and the Gallup Strengths Finder assessment, and the whole idea of focusing on people's strengths instead of their weaknesses and getting people to be more successful that way. And people really are thinking more about their whole life. So that's a slide I would put up all the time when I would talk to managers or directors, or be talking about, right, kind of what the workforce is going to look like now and in the future. And then COVID hit, right? And right now, I feel like the workforce is completely different as well, right? We've hit a point where we're focused on my health. People are worried about their health. They're worried about their family's health. They're trying to figure out their family, right? So many people I know trying to figure out how to homeschool their kids or stay in touch with their parents or, right, just how the family is working. Folks are wondering what their impact is, both on the company and as well as kind of the world as a whole. They're really worried about security, right? Job security, money, all of those things. And people's coworkers, many have disappeared, right? In the sense that they are working from home, so they're not seeing their coworkers every day, and they're trying to figure out how this works. So, knowing that the workforce is changing and will continue to change, we're going to have to start thinking a little bit more about culture. So, when I start to talk about culture, I want to start by putting a definition out there about it, right? There's not a one hard and fast definition about workplace culture or group culture. But really, truly, in my mind, right, culture is the vibe that you feel when you walk in the door, right? It is the sense of purpose you feel as an employee there. It's kind of the mood and the tone that the work environment creates for you. It includes the leadership style, right? And it's this idea of kind of how all of you as employees work together towards this common goal. You could kind of call it like the personality of a company. Um, right. So I see it including things like the mission, the vision, the goals of your workplace, your actual workspace, the people, the expectations that you have, um, the expectations that are set for you, as well as the expectations you have of the workplace, and the goals that you have. So, uh, thinking about that, right? Think about what group culture and what workplace culture is going to mean to you. So when I think about this, I start to, and when I work with companies on this, people will ask me, why is work culture important? Um, right? I think gone are the times where people just kind of like to show up to a job, do the job, and go home. People want a place where they feel that they fit in. So, thinking about that, last year Deloitte did a huge study of recent college graduates and also just new hires at companies. 95% of them said they value culture over compensation, right? People have talked about repeatedly they will take a job for less money if the culture is better for a better fit for them. So think about that, right? 95% of people are willing to have a lower paycheck for better work culture that fits with them. Um, the most recent poll that Gallup did found 87% of employees worldwide are not engaged at their office. They're not engaged in the work that they're doing. So if we can get people to be highly engaged in their work, how you do that is through a work culture that works. Companies that have a weak culture or no culture to them, they have found that they have a 3.5 times turnover, 3.5 times the turnover, as do companies that have a strong work culture. And we all know, right, those of us who have hired and have replaced people, that every time you replace somebody, it costs you thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. And then 147% greater earnings per share when employees are highly engaged and say they work for a company with a good work culture. So really when it comes down to it is people who work for companies that they fit with that work culture and the work culture is a strong one are more productive. They have better relationships with their coworkers. They have better relationships with your customers. They're overall healthier employees. And they found that the employees' needs and values, when they're consistent with the workplace's needs and values, it is just a much better place to work. So, I also want to talk a little bit about culture during a crisis. So, right at this moment in time, we are in crisis mode, right? We're living through a pandemic. This is completely different than what we've done before. And in the past and currently, right, companies who have strong cultures have been able to pivot in a way that others aren't. So, right, thinking really simply about places like Tesla, right? Tesla pivoted really quickly from building cars to building ventilators. Uh, and how does Tesla do that? Well, Tesla has set up, they have six mantras. I have two friends who work at Tesla, and they say that these are all over the workplace, right? You hear and you see these six mantras everywhere you go. And those are move fast, do the impossible, constantly innovate, reason from first principles. And people aren't familiar with the idea of first principles. A first principle is pretty much like a basic assumption that cannot be deduced any further. Like scientists use it all the time, right? How do you get first principles, like the most basic form of something? Um, think like owners, and we are all in. Right? Those are Tesla's six mantras. And so they built a company corporate culture that set up with these ideas, right? So right now, when they switched from saying, okay, we need to start building ventilators, the idea of move fast, do the impossible, and constantly innovate, right? That was easy. They were easily able to quickly do that because everybody was in on that, right? This is a culture they have built. So the other one on the right there, if anyone has guessed, right, this is Pixar. So Pixar has been um, known, right, for their work culture from day one. They have been a place that has been very unique. Except when after Pixar released Toy Story, I forget what their second movie was, but then when they started to come out with Toy Story 2, they started to fail very quickly, right? They really saw that the movie was being really flat. Nobody was excited about it, all the quick previews of it. And they thought, okay, originally they were going to send it right to video, right? They weren't even going to send it to the movies. So Toy Story realized they needed to pivot. I'm sorry, Pixar realized they needed to pivot really quickly. And so they legitimately shut down all other productions and went all in on Toy Story 2. And they came up with this mantra and this big piece that said, if you give a good idea to a mediocre team, they'll screw it up. But if you give a mediocre idea to a great team, they'll make it work. So they saw Toy Story 2 as something with a mediocre idea, and they brought it to this great team and decided to make it work, right? That they decided it was going to be unacceptable to produce a mediocre film. It was only going to be acceptable to make a fabulous film. So they hit their moment of crisis and changed their culture and really kind of talked about everything we touch needs to be excellent and kind of worked that way. So companies have been able to pivot this during times of crisis. There's many other stories, but those were kind of two quick ones. And the other thing to remember that's really important, right? If your company culture is simply founded on the idea of foosball and snacks, right? That's what a lot of people think company culture is. We throw a foosball table in and now we have great culture here. Then as soon as you've all scattered and are now working from home, your culture has fallen apart, right? So, and now that you're working from a home office, if your main idea of company culture was to have a really cool break room or foosball, or I've been at companies where there's bean bags or the most amazing kitchen, or um, one place I visited in Boston at one point that I was working with had cold brew coffee on tap. Right? Really cool things. But if that's the whole basis for your company culture, well, when you're working at home, the foosball table doesn't really help you. So I recently started reading the book, The Culture Code. And in it, Daniel Coyne talks about this idea of three sets of skills that you need to build strong teams. And I will say that if you kind of follow some of these ideas, right, this is where you will be able to really, truly build a great culture that is going to make your team wildly successful. So it's these kind of three areas, right? It's around building safety, having share vulnerability, and establish purpose. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these and kind of how this can play out in a time like right now, and how you can build these strict cultures while you're not in the same room together. So, this idea of building safety, right? The idea of building safety is really setting it up that you create an environment where it's okay to provide feedback regardless of status or role. This is the places that do really well, right? So, how can you do this? Over communicate your listening. It's a little harder when we're all apart. So, think about when you're on a Zoom call, right? You can all tell the person who, if you have me on video at the moment, right? You can tell the person who's looking at their phone or not looking at the screen and looking away. So, think about your body language on Zoom. And as much as I know we all are kind of getting sick of um, having our videos on, right? It can be really important to do that. So, how do you make it look like you're paying attention? So, one simple trick is to make, the little box with your picture in it that you can see yourself. Put that right under where the camera is on your computer. So it's right at the middle. So you're looking directly there. If you put your Zoom into speaker view, it kind of puts that green box around the person who's talking. That can be really helpful for people as well. Um, the other thing is to really make sure that you're paying attention. So there are going to be times where you're not, obviously, right? Some of us have been on Zoom calls for way too many hours, but really make sure when it's important that you're paying attention and you're listening to the folks. So, one of the second thing around building safety for your staff and your team is to spotlight your fallibility, right? This is the idea of saying things, particularly at a time like this, regularly, that are things like, what am I missing? Um, I could be wrong here, but is this where people are thinking? Because without having everybody in the room at the same time, it can be hard to take that read. So think about, how can you make sure that everybody sees that you're acceptable with this? Um, the next part of building safety around this idea of giving feedback, right, is to embrace the messenger, right? Everyone knows the saying, right? Don't shoot the messenger, but let's change it and make it the opposite. Really think about, how do you embrace the person who comes to you with a problem, who comes to you and points out the things that might be going wrong? How do you bring that in and kind of celebrate that and say, gosh, it might have taken a lot for you to do that, but I'm so glad that you did. The next part of building safety is to overdo your thank yous, right? Make sure you are thanking people. And sometimes, particularly right now, it may feel like you're thanking people for doing the very basic tasks that you have hired them to do. But at this moment in time, sometimes those very basic tasks are taking way more effort than before, right? People may not have all of the tools that they need. They may be trying to homeschool children or multiple children. They may have a toddler home, or they may just have dogs who need to go for walks, or they may just be really stressed out about this. So, overdo your thank yous. Make people feel like what they are doing is appreciated. Make sure everybody has a voice. And this, again, when you're not all together, can be a little harder. So, think about ways you can do this. Set up one-on-one meetings with the people who report to you, but also set those up with the people who report to them. Think about the whole chain of people who might float up to you as a leader, and how can you set up a time with each of them? Now, if you have like 70 people in your chain, it doesn't mean that you can set up an hour-long one-to-one meeting with everybody every week. You obviously don't have time for that. But if you can set up a 20-minute meeting with everybody over the next month, those things goes a long way. And ask questions like, what would you change if you were in charge of this? Right? What would you do differently? Next piece about kind of building safety, the idea of the shit sandwich, right, is really popular out there when giving feedback. That idea that you say something nice, You tell them what they need to improve, and then you say something nice again. And the problem that has been found with this over time is that folks focus on one or the other. They end up focusing completely on the negative piece that you told them, or they completely focus on the positive piece, both of which are not what you want them to do in that case. So try to separate those things out a little bit. So talk about something that someone needs to improve upon in a way that lets them see that they can use this to grow. And the last piece about building safety is this idea of picking up the trash. It was interesting reading the Culture Code book. There's probably about 5 or 6 pages that talk on and on about CEOs or coaches or leaders who go out and do this. One was about the coach of one of the NBA teams who goes into the locker room after every game and literally picks up with the trash that's on the ground and throws it away. But as the supervisor, as the leader, or even as just someone on the team, be the person who does that, right? Be the person who does what seems to be the lowest level job and show people that you care, right? Um, really go with this mentality of it's fine to celebrate success, but also heed the lessons of failure. So, in this idea that building safety, embrace when people come to you with problems. Embrace when people give you feedback, regardless of what their status or role is in the company. Think about a way that you're open to everybody giving you feedback. All right, so the next kind of important piece of building culture is this idea of vulnerability. If you haven't watched Brene Brown's Netflix special on Daring Greatly, uh, I highly, highly recommend it. She talks a lot about there is no ability to be courageous without being vulnerable. She has a podcast. You can listen to that as well. The Netflix special was great. I particularly love a lot of her work, but really, she talks a lot about vulnerability. So let's talk about that. When we talk about share vulnerability, we talk about this the idea of the habits of mutual risk driving cooperation, right? That we are all in this together. We are all taking the risk and we're going to share this. So, how do you do this? One thing is you as the leader making sure you're seen as vulnerable first and often, possibly, right? A couple of recent examples that I saw, there was the CEO of Shake Shack, Dave Cooper. He has a TED talk that he did as a major restaurateur. And when he showed his staff the TED talk, he started by saying, I was absolutely terrified. You can see in my TED talk, my legs were shaking. I could barely stand, right? So he was putting himself out there as someone who was vulnerable. Recently, a man named Chris Lister, he's the CEO of a company called Buildium. So Buildium, they are a company that does some kind of technology for real estate. And so last week, he broke down in tears during his staff meeting. He had 200 staff on a Zoom meeting. And as he was talking about the stress of COVID-19 with his staff, he burst out into tears. And he actually wrote a couple of articles on about it, of saying how being vulnerable really set up his team to then all come in together and say, what can we do together? So think about the ability to share your vulnerability as a leader. Make sure that you are over communicating expectations, right? So think about what are the expectations of your team now, and that people understand what they are. So IDEO, which is a really neat kind of design firm. If you don't know anything about IDEO, they're one of those great ones to follow. They've had a lot of great free webinars lately about working from home and design thinking during this time. But IDEO, one of their expectations, right, is that we all collaborate together to make others successful. And so, in order to do this, right, they started a whole bunch of Slack channels. And so, right now, when they talk about they want to over communicate expectations, somebody posted who knows anything about virtual yoga classes and got like 50 different people who responded to it on their Slack channel because the expectation is that you collaborate to make others successful at IDEO. So think about what the expectations are at this moment in time and make sure everybody knows them. And at this time, during crisis like this, it's hard for people and it's stressful. So knowing that, you really do have to kind of over communicate these expectations because otherwise people forget, right? We have so much going on in our minds right now. We're so stressed out that we need that over communication. Think about the critical moments as you're building your team culture. And so, right, two really big critical moments are the first time somebody is vulnerable in your group and what happens. So, what happens to the staff person who falls down and breaks down on a Zoom meeting crying about what's happening right now, right? Making sure that those moments turn into everybody rallying around that person, right? What happens when somebody shares their vulnerability? And the second critical moment is the first time there's a disagreement that happens within the group, right? That we disagree about how things should be happening right now. And this is where, as a leader, what do you do, right? How do you take that moment of disagreement and make sure that people feel safe and that they're able to kind of communicate with each other? One of the other ways for shared vulnerability is to use practices like AAR, which is the idea of an after action review, I guess technically a military term, or the idea of something called a brain trust. And so brain trust is Pixar's version of this. So in AAR, the after action review is the idea that after everything you do, you kind of ask these 5 specific questions. What were our intended results? What were our actual results? What caused us to have these results? Do we do the same thing next time or we do something different? So, really stopping as a team after any time you complete something and kind of asking those questions. So, Pixar has something that they dubbed the brain trust, right? And so the brain trust is the idea is that leaders from a different team come in and critique a project's strengths and weaknesses. They are not allowed to offer any solutions. All they do is highlight potential problems or holes in what they see. And the idea of this is that they can come in and do these, and then the team that's been working on it can then go and put the solutions together. So, not like an outside person is giving them solutions. One thing that's important during this shared vulnerability and this kind of big feedback loop is to aim for candor, but avoiding brutal honesty, right? And so the difference there, candor feedback is usually much smaller, it's much more targeted and less personal. So when you're using candor, you're making sure that you're being very specific about something and that you're not coming in and kind of bashing another person, but much more a very specific um, kind of kind of targeted thing that you're looking at. And then the last piece that's important for the shared vulnerability is to separate out performance review and professional development. And this in most companies goes hand in hand, right? You get your annual performance review, and that's the same time you talk about your professional development. And in order to have some really good kind of assessment and feedback loop happening and having a good culture of that, you have to pull those things apart. You have to be able to sit down with someone and talk about the performance review, talk about the things they're doing really well, and kind of build on those. And then look at their professional development ongoing. All right. And then the third piece that they talked about in the culture code is this idea of establishing purpose, right? And thinking about it. Nike is one of those companies that's done a really nice job with establishing purpose and having this simple catchphrase, right, of just do it. It is what they use by their employees. It's what they use as their kind of advertising. It is what they do. It is the idea of going out and just getting it done. And that is their purpose. So, as we think about establishing purchase, this is the idea that now you have this shared culture that defines the group's kind of purpose, goals, and how they do things. So you've already looked at building safety, so people are comfortable with feedback now. You've shared vulnerability, you make sure that people are trusting each other. Now you can build your purpose. So here's where you name and rank your priorities. And you need to be 10 times clearer about your priorities than you actually think you should be. Here's where, during something like now, right, during COVID, you'd need to take a step back and think, here were my priorities before, and here are the priorities we have now. At this moment, I would probably tell you to have no more than 3 priorities for your team right now. And maybe you're working on a team that only has one single priority, right? So think about, what are the priorities today? What are the things right now that we need to be focused on? And then make sure all of the work that is getting done floats up to those priorities, right? So, Inc. magazine did a study 2 years ago that went out to top CEOs and said, how many of your staff can name the top 3 priorities of your company? And the guess was, across CEOs, that it came out to be the average was they thought 64% of their staff would be able to name their top 3 priorities. And the staff on this included everybody. So everybody from the CEO down to the, part-time, per diem, hourly paid employee. So everybody, can you name the top 3 priorities of our company? And then when Inc. went and actually surveyed the staff, it ends up only 2% of staff could name the top 3 priorities of their company, which means that even though these CEOs thought they were being clear, they're definitely not. So, what are the top 1 to 3 priorities of your team at this moment in time? And when you're figuring out those priorities, those should be floating right down, right? So if you're the director, it should be coming directly from the CEO who says, right, here's what you need to do. Then you're going to translate those to your team to make sure they know what it is. So if you're someone who maybe you're not in a management or leadership position right now, make sure you know what your top 1 to 3 priorities are. And then start thinking, is the work I'm doing now helping to boost those? Because the priorities that you had back in February are probably vastly different than what they are right now. I've worked with companies over the last 2 months that their staff had to change drastically how they did things, right? From in person events to online engagement, from meeting individually with customers in a store to now figuring out, how do we build things online for our customers that bring them in and get them that same personalized experience. So think about what your priorities are, and does your team actually know what they are? Um, Embrace catchphrases. This is kind of a little cheesy, but I will say that companies that have a catchphrase that kind of sets up what their culture is really, truly helps. Um, yes. So Susan just said she thinks purpose and priorities and process to achieve the priorities are different. Absolutely, Susan. So we can talk about that a little bit before we move on to the catchphrases, right? So um, there is a purpose in what it is, right? There is purpose in your role, and there's purpose um, of kind of what our group's purpose is within the company. And then we have, what are the priorities that we have to do? So I think by setting up your priorities, it helps to kind of figure out your purpose a little bit as well, and vice versa. Did you have any other thoughts on that, Susan?
My thinking was when you said meeting people in face-to-face meetings
Mhm.
is different than if I'm a mediator. And so my purpose is to help people resolve conflict. My process has changed, but my priority hasn't. So that was my thinking when you said that you have to redo things, you have to rethink your priorities. My thinking was you may not have to rethink your priorities, but your process and how you achieve your priorities. So didn't mean
Absolutely.
that's what was running through my head when you were talking.
No, I'm glad you clarified that because that is 100% true. Um, I do think some companies might have had, or I think of one team that I'm working with, right? Their priorities, I think of one staff in particular, had two priorities that she was kind of focused on, both of which were very large in person events that have been completely canceled. So her priority of making those successful events now has completely changed. And so the purpose, right, her purpose in her role was to engage people and thinking, how do you kind of reestablish that purpose and think about now, what are my priorities? So, yes, I agree completely. So, quite often, that it's really the process of what we're doing might be changing. So, talking a little bit about catchphrases, this is where the Nike just do it kind of piece comes in. But I also think of companies, Zappos is one that always comes to mind for me. Their catchphrase is create fun and a little weirdness, right? So their employees talk about this idea of being fun and a little bit weird at the same time at Zappos, and that makes them kind of a really fun culture to work at. So if you hear that catchphrase of creating fun and a little weirdness, and it makes you like this is the worst thing you've ever heard, Zappos is probably not the right place for you. And that's okay because the culture of where you work is so important to whether or not you're going to fit in and like your job. So thinking about that, right? Shake Shack, the CEO of Shake Shack owns a variety of different restaurants, but his kind of catchphrase that all the employees said is they talk about they want to create raves for guests. And I'm like, okay, right, interesting thing. That sets up what the whole place looks like and feels like if these are the catchphrases that people are saying all the time. When people think of something like Nike and you think of just do it, that instantly gets you into that mindset of this is a place that's going to innovate and move quickly. Now, if you are not someone who likes to innovate and move quickly, if you are someone who likes to go deep into data and do some real focused analysis and be really deliberative, it's probably not the right place for you, right? There are other places that have that culture. And so think about what is the right culture. The next piece is to measure what matters to you. So if you decide your purpose um, is, really good customer service. So Zappos, I'm going to use them once again, right? So Zappos, they talked about, right, wanting to have great customer service. So they have this call center where you can call in with all of your questions. Well, when they first started measuring success at their call center, they did what every other call center in the world measured, right? How quickly call center people could get somebody to resolution and off the phone. And what they started to realize is that's not what really mattered to them. What mattered to them was not how many calls, it wasn't how productive someone was. What mattered to them was, did the person on the other end, did the customer feel an emotional connection? Did they get something that felt like a good resolution to their problem? But a lot of it had to do with the emotions, right? Did they feel good about Zappos when they hung up, even if they had had a problem? So Zappos stopped tracking how long it took you and how many calls you did during your time, but started ranking things on this emotional kind of ranking. And so when people got off the call, they were asked, right, kind of more emotional based questions. How did you feel when the person helped you? Things like that. Uh, and my favorite part of this is Zappos had a call center person who managed to be on the phone with someone for over 10 hours. So it was somebody who was a very lonely person, right? Who started talking and they never got off the phone. And instead of being horrified by this, right, in probably any other call center in the world, you'd be fired for being on the phone with someone for 10 hours. That is not what they're looking for. They're looking for quick resolution. But Zappos, on the other hand, sent out a press release about this and told the story and wrote it up all over, right? They really celebrated this because to them, that's what mattered. Still not quite sure exactly how someone could spend 10 hours on the phone with a call center person. But right, you can see the difference. And then the last people here is focus on what is known as bar setting behaviors. So bar setting behaviors are the ideas that are the small single tasks that people can focus on. Because if folks pay attention to that one small single task, then other things will build. So these are simple things. One of the stories they talked about was the hockey team at Quinnipiac University and the coach there who used to use the phrase 40 for 40, that he wanted everybody to do back checks. If you know hockey, they wanted that after 40 back checks, you'll do one that was going to be helpful in a game. 39 of them were going to be completely useless. But if you did it every single time, that 40th one will be so important that it will help. And it's that idea of picking a single task and focus on it. It is the idea of the salt shaker being in the exact right place at every Shake Shack. It is KIPP, the kind of charter school company in New York City, who water bottles are placed in exactly the same place on every kid's desk on the first day of school, right? That there are these routine and bar setting behaviors for folks that make them feel accomplished because they did that single task correctly. And those add up and become the things that make a difference. So the last piece I wanted to talk really briefly about is Gallup talks about there are 4 keys to leadership to Gallup. And as someone who does a lot with StrengthsFinder and Gallup, I really love these and the idea of how these 4 things can set you up for a really good culture, particularly right now when folks aren't in the same place. So, one is the idea of trust. And Gallup surveys over time have shown that only 1 in 3 employees trust the leadership of their company. 1 in 3. So, right, 2/3 of your staff do not trust the people who are in leadership roles. So, knowing that right now is not the time to shy away from hard conversations, right? Try to be the person who is as predictable as possible in these unpredictable times, right? Be willing to have the conversations, be willing to say, I don't know, right? This is not the time to be kind of making stuff up, but it is the time to saying, right, we have no idea what things are going to look like. A lot of the consulting work I do is in higher ed. We have no idea what higher ed is going to look like in September. All right. The University of California system yesterday just announced that they will not be holding any in-person classes for the fall semester. On the other hand, Purdue has come out and said they will be 100% in person, right? They are going forward with in-person classes for the fall. We have no idea what it is, but know that you can set up the idea of trust by simply being as communicative as possible. Compassion, right? Right now, how you treat people is going to be remembered more than anything. People are not going to remember the tasks that they did every day during COVID. They're not going to remember, right, whether or not they met their goals, but they will remember how compassionate you are for them during this moment in time. I think it was the Wayfair CEO who said a couple of weeks ago, right, I expect my employees to be working at about 50% right now, right? There's so much going on in their lives that I don't expect 100% output from my staff. And I will be paying 100% of their salaries, but I don't expect them to be doing 100% of the work, right? That level of compassion and understanding for what people are going through means so much right now. Stability. Oh, this is so hard right now, right? It is so hard. There's not a single one of us who could say with 100% certainty that anybody will have their job, right? 3 months from now or a month from now. We don't know what's going to happen. And so during this time, the best you can do is make sure that you and your team have what they need to get their jobs done, right? And that you are able to kind of communicate progress, that when you see things moving forward, you can say, great, right? Look at the accomplishments we're having. So make sure that you're showing folks that things are going in the right direction. And the last one here is hope, right? Um, Gosh, right? Give people a reason to hope that tomorrow will be better and that they will then be motivated to kind of dig deeper and to do more for you. Right. So some other really simple things to kind of building culture now, right? Trying to find some ways to inject a little fun. People are missing the water cooler moments, for those who work in an office or, right, who are interacting with customers regularly. Try to figure out how you can do something fun. You know, uh, I have a friend who her work team decided every Wednesday at lunch they're going to do terrible arts and crafts. So each team member kind of comes up with some really hideous thing that you can make, right? Their total Pinterest fails and kind of showing everybody that. I've seen companies do, here are all the different Zoom backgrounds, right? I've seen companies do Zoom background meetings, having themes to them, right? Kind of showcasing people's animals and kids and all of those different things. Um, Figuring out ways to make some social connections now, doing some one on one things with folks. There's a lot of Zoom fatigue, so I don't recommend doing every single thing on Zoom or video conferencing, whichever you're using, but thinking about what are some things that we can do to have fun. I know another company started doing like the old TV show, I don't, maybe it's still on, MTV Cribs, uh, that TV show where people would show the great houses of these famous musicians. People are doing house tours of their homes for their coworkers and things like that. So think about something fun, right? Things that way that you can continue to do things you would normally have done in the office. So if you typically had cake for everybody's birthday in your office, make sure you're singing happy birthday to people, right, on your Zoom meeting, or sending virtual birthday cards to people, or mailing a birthday card to folks. One of the teams I'm consulting with right now, I made sure to get everybody's home address, and I've been trying to mail 1 or 2 cards a week to somebody on the team, um, just to kind of say, thanks for the hard work you're doing. Thanks for helping me with this project, or, right, happy birthday, or like whatever it is, thinking of that. So try to find ways that you can do kind of some virtual things that are the things that you normally would do in your workplace that you can now do or now figure out ways to do from afar. Uh, so, the more you can do to think about the culture that you had when you were in person or pre COVID, thinking about ways to transfer that over, the better off your staff will be and the more they'll feel connected during this time. So, with that,